empower all of you to play pastor today. By the time we're done, you're going to go, oh, well, why do we need Roger and John? See, it's like we have all this we can do. We're going to look at the Word of God. You might even start to say at some point, this doesn't seem like a normal church anniversary message. Hang on till the end, and I think you'll see how it all comes together. I'm going to look at two stories in the New Testament. I'm going to read them to you. If you want to follow with me in your Bible, you can open them. They're both going to be in the book of Mark. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in the New Testament. We're going to look at Mark chapter 6, and then a story in Mark chapter 8. So I'm going to tell you how this is going to go so you can be listening a certain way. When I'm done reading the two stories, I'm going to ask you to share a lesson that if you were a teacher or a preacher, this would be one lesson about God or about following Jesus that we could learn. And then I'll let somebody else share. We're not going to have time for everybody to share a lesson, but quite a few of you will be able to. You only get one chance, and then we let somebody else go, so choose something really good. And you don't get to talk really long, because I'm the one with the microphone. And that's what matters, right? So I want to actually do this as a team, though. So you're going to get a chance to share together with some of this. So listen to these two stories and ask yourself, what would be a lesson from this story if I were a pastor or teacher that I want to share? All right? So we're going to pick it up. Mark chapter 6, we're going to drop all the way down to verse 30. Verse 30 says this. The apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all they had done and taught. Well, let me just tell you, they just got back from a short-term mission trip. Jesus has sent them out. They went into different towns in the countryside. They've just come back. By the way, while they were gone, Jesus' cousin, John, known as John the Baptist, had actually been executed by a Roman leader. So, two significant things have happened as we get to this part of the story. Now let's pick it up again. Then, because there were so many people coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat, he said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." And they went, I put on my glasses and you can see this better. There it goes. So they went away by themselves into a boat, into a solitary place. But many who saw them leaving recognized them, and they ran on foot from all the towns, and they got there ahead of them. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. By this time it was late in the day, so his disciples came to him. "This is a remote place," they said. "It's already very late. Send the people away, so that they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But Jesus answered, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Well, that would take more than a half year's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat?" "Well, how many loaves do you have?" he asked. "Go and see." And they found out, and they said, 5, and 2 fish. And Jesus directed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So they all sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking to heaven, he gave thanks, and he broke the loaves. And then he gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all, and they all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. The number of men that had eaten was 5,000. All right, story number 1. Now we're going to jump ahead 2 chapters, chapter 8. Chapter 8, verse 1. Not the same story. It's not deja vu. Different story, different time, a few months later. Pick up in verse 1. During those days, another large crowd gathered. Since they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him and said, "I have compassion for these people. They have already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will collapse on the way, because some of them came from a long distance." His disciples answered, "But where in this remote place can anyone get enough bread to feed them?" "Well, how many loaves do you have?" Jesus asked. 7, they replied. And he told the crowd to sit down on the ground. And when he had taken the 7 loaves and given thanks, he broke them, gave them to the disciples to distribute to the people, and they did so. and they had a few small fish as well. He gave thanks for them also, and told the disciples to distribute them. And the people ate and were satisfied. Afterward, the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. About 4,000 were present. And then he sent them away, and he got into a boat with his disciples and went into the region of Dalmanutha. All right, 2 stories. If you're getting paid to be the preacher today, what would you teach out of these 2 stories? If you could be the teacher in a Bible study, what would you teach? Someone gets to be brave and tell me one lesson and break the ice for us. Who will do that? Yes?
The lack of faith that was shown, since he already showed them before previously that he could provide, just trusting God to provide.
Okay.
He said faith of a mustard seed.
Okay. Elsewhere, Jesus talks about just having a small amount of faith, like the faith of a mustard seed. The point, if you couldn't hear that he was making, is there seemed to be a lack of faith because they have the same story. Did you ever wonder about how long it took until they went, I think this sounds familiar? All right? At what point did they go, wow, we've been here before? And it seemed to take them a while to get their minds around the idea that Jesus could do it again. Now, we can pick on them for their lack of faith, and they did kind of show a lack of faith there. Can I just ask a question of all of us? How many times in life have you had to learn the same lesson over again? How many times has God had to come to you again and again because we're a little bit thick sometimes in our skull? And doesn't this story help us understand how gracious God is to us, that he puts up with us when we have small faith, a lack of faith? If it were me, and it was all of you, and I did this miracle, and you all, and then we did it again a couple months later, and you still didn't get it, I might be tempted to get a little bit irritated with you, a little bit frustrated with you. But do you catch that in Jesus at all? No. Jesus is like, well, how many loaves of bread you got? Let's see what we're going to do here. And he graciously shows them and builds their faith all over again. That's a great lesson you brought up. Thank you. One great lesson. We got one sermon down already. Anything else we can learn out of this story? Have we exhausted it? Somebody give me another lesson. Yes, in the back.
God will always provide.
God will always provide. So, isn't it amazing? Let's just think about this for a second. This is a huge lesson from this story. That God will provide. God takes care of the needs of his people. Now, is having bread and having, a meal the most important thing in life? Well, maybe not. But you start to get bothered if you don't have it, right? And Jesus took care of that. He took care of that need. By the way, was he taking care of other needs at the same time? He was. He was teaching them. He was healing people. There's many ways that he's taking care of their needs. How wonderfully caring he is that he would take care of our needs. Can somebody else build off of that? I think you're onto something. Can you talk to me a little bit? Can somebody give me another lesson about how he took care of our needs in these stories? Can you see something? Anything? Yeah.
He can provide, like, what we would see as if something is totally impossible.
Okay.
It's like nothing. I mean, it's just like, okay, we can do this.
Right. Yeah, if you couldn't hear, he's like, God can provide just amazing stuff, mostly out of nothing, right? I mean, just, how could he do so much? Did you catch how many basketfuls? By the way, in the original language, that where it says 12 basketfuls, they'd be baskets about like this, so I could hold it like this, 12 basketfuls. In the second story where it's 7 basketfuls, the baskets, if you think of them on the floor, they'd be about this high. Different kinds of baskets, big baskets. So they're different, but in each case, God not only gave them enough, he gave them more than enough. And isn't that just like God? I mean, we could hardly give everybody a bite to eat. And yet he gives them, and they actually have leftovers. How astounding is God in the way he provides. By the way, do you think he can do that for a church family today?
Amen.
Now, he doesn't have to do it with bread and fish. You guys got great food. We're all going to have it in a little while. But I think there's other ways. that God will continue to provide for this church so that it can continue to have an eternal kingdom impact. How incredible is God? God provides, and God provides a lot. Is there anything else in the provision part that we can learn on this? Anything that would stand out to you? Yeah.
God provides in the most remote areas.
Okay. God provides in the most remote areas. It just seems flat out impossible. Can you imagine the disciples? Jesus calls them all together. Hey, everyone, over here. We're having a little talk. He says, we need to feed them. He said, people are getting hungry. They're going to get irritable. They need a Snickers bar, like the commercial says. And they're just going to start getting like that. And we need to take care of them. And they look at him and they go, Jesus, we're miles away from the closest 7-Eleven. Right? He's like, how in the world? We can't do this. And what does somebody say? It would take half a year's wages. I don't know what an average wage is. Let's say, we'll just use $40,000 as an average wage. I don't even know. Basically, they're saying, we could have $20,000 to go get meals for everybody. It would just feed them for one meal. And it really wouldn't solve anything. It just feed them for one meal. Is that really the best use of our money? That's kind of what they're saying to him. And yet Jesus provides. Now, did you notice how he provided? What did he use?
Think about it a little bit, and those stories he talks about his compassion.
Right?
It's unbelievable unmerited favor that he shows to us, so we don't deserve it. He still gives it.
Good. It's compassion. As a matter of fact, let's hold that thought for a minute. I want us to catch compassion in a minute. And I think you're onto something really good. And that's an important lesson. Think about the provision part first before we get to that. In one of the other stories, we find out that when Jesus said, hey, go find out what you have, they found this little boy with his lunch pail. All right? Can you imagine trying to get food away from a child? Have you tried? Okay. But that's essentially, hey, we found this kid. He's got like 5 small loaves and a couple fish his mom gave him, wrapped them all up really nice. He says he's willing to share. We'll see. See how this goes. Did you ever think about this? Did Jesus need the boy with the 5 loaves and the fish? He doesn't, right? I mean, he created the universe out of nothing with just a word. So if Jesus wanted to, he could have just said, God, thank you. Could you, everybody would have a happy meal on their lap, right? Or a pizza. It could easily happen. He could do whatever he wanted to. But I will say, I think there's a principle here in the provision of God. That God typically uses what we have in our hands to do and provide for the work he wants to accomplish. So, you might not think you have much. You might think you're not very talented. You might think you don't have much in the way of money or resources. You might think you're not very gifted. You might think that you've had a bad shake in life. You might think you're too tall, too short, too anywhere in between. You might think you're too young, too old. You might think you don't have much to offer. But a little boy with 5 loaves and 2 fish was more than enough for God to take care of thousands upon thousands of people. We know how many men there were. That doesn't even count the children and the women who are part of the crowd. And I just would simply say to all of you, and even to you as a church, you're not a large church, right? You can find bigger churches. You're a wonderful church. And the principle remains, God can do much with a small amount if it's offered to him willingly.
Yeah.
He can do that with your gifts and your talents. You might think, I don't know what I can do. Just watch what God can do through you. You might think as a church, I'm not sure we can really make an impact for eternity and among the people of this community. And just watch what God can do. He typically will not do it out of nothing. He will do it out of the small things that we willingly offer to him. How incredible is the provision of God? One other thought on the provision before we move to the compassion. Did you notice who he had do the work of the provision? Who did he invite to join him in doing the work? Who was it? His disciples, right? The apostles. So he's got these 12 guys who are like, wait a minute, we didn't volunteer for this. All right? Jesus, think about this. Jesus says to them, hey, here's what I want you guys to do. We got these loaves and fish. I think this is going to work. I'm going to pray in a minute, but before I pray, I'd like you to get everybody and go have them sit down. Here's the 50s, 100s on the grass. You go take care of that, all right? And then you come back to me. Come back. She's like, okay. And he does this prayer thing. And then, imagine you're the first one. So, let's say, Roger, you're the first of the 12 disciples that's there. So, pretend I'm Jesus. I'm clearly not.
Yeah.
Okay, but I come up to you. Now, I've got 12 of you guys. I've got 5 loaves to split among the 12 guys, which means you're not even getting half a loaf.
Right.
And these aren't like Wonder Bread loaves. This is like a little bit of bread that's out there. So I'm tearing it off and giving you this. So think of how it would be if you're the one Jesus just handed less than half a loaf and says, all right, here's what I want you to do. See that group of 50 over there? You go and start sharing that with them. Can you imagine what you would think about as you walked over there? Oh, this is a bad idea. This is a bad idea. This is just really going to go poorly, right? Jesus is going to be embarrassed. I'm going to be embarrassed. I don't know how this will be. I've got enough here. Teresita's going to get a little bit. I got maybe a bite for each of you. And good luck. All right? That's going through his head, right? Isn't that what you'd be thinking when you walk over there?
Yep.
And yet, as I tear off and give some of it to Teresita, I tear off and I just keep having more in my hand. And I actually come back around in 1 second, and we keep doing this. And I think there's something interesting about how God uses people. Not only does he take, like that little boy had, the loaves and the fish, and say, hey, watch what I can do with what little you offer. God tends to put us in places that are actually going to stretch our faith. You talked about faith at the beginning. And yeah, they seem to forget by the second story, but imagine what it was to be obedient to Jesus even though you don't have a clue how it's going to work out. And you think this is going to go badly. But they obey. And isn't that really what faith is all about? It's not so much that we have it all figured out, but we know that we need to obey Jesus. And that's what they do. And amazing things happen. So, well, you brought up provision, and we could just go like 6 different ways with that. And it's all amazing how Jesus works to do this. He uses people, he uses gifts, he uses small resources, and he provides, and we have leftovers. It's incredible.
It
Now,
is.
you brought up compassion. Did you notice that the word compassion showed up in both stories? Right? I imagine that means it's significant. I don't know. I wasn't in line to get the compassion merit badge when I was a kid. I don't know. I'm just not the most compassionate person. Some of you are probably far more loving, compassionate, and caring than I am. If I were the public speaker, and we were all out together in the field, and we weren't close to anywhere, and it was the end of the day and you didn't have much food, here's what I might be tempted to think, or even say. Well, what were you thinking? How in the world would you come out here and spend all day and you didn't bring enough food? I mean, this little boy brought his food and you didn't bring any food? Where's your brains? What's wrong with all you people? Isn't that the way, that's what I might tend to be. You're probably a lot more caring and spiritual than me. But you notice in both cases, that's not Jesus, is it? The heart of Jesus is one that shows compassion and cares for people and their needs. Sometimes we have a problem and it was our own fault. Sometimes we have a problem and it wasn't our fault, but it got dumped on us. But either way, Jesus has compassion. And I'm so grateful to follow a God like that.
Yes.
And I'm so grateful that even though I don't have a lot of natural compassion, that the closer I get to Jesus, maybe just a little bit more of his compassion starts to fill and spill out of my life. And maybe yours as well. Thanks. That's another great lesson. We've hit like 7 lessons. We could do a whole sermon series just on these 2 stories, Roger. It would take like 6 months. Somebody else. Is there any other lessons out of this, or is that it? It's not it, by the way. Yes.
If we follow God's will, no matter what, we can stop. It's God's will, it's just gonna go, it's unstoppable.
Okay? God's will is unstoppable. Tell me how you see that in this story.
Just like, he wanted them to fall on him.
Okay.
And when they fall on him, and they didn't have food, but it didn't matter.
Right.
God provided for them. And
Yep.
it didn't matter what was going on, no one in the world was right.
Yep.
So through, people fall, they did, and he provided for them.
That's great. Great lesson. You might not be able to hear. I'm going to summarize it in my own words, okay? But I think I catch it. If we follow Jesus, God will provide for us. We're back to that provision, but it's the idea, if we follow Jesus, God will provide for us. Have you ever had this sense like, I know what I'm supposed to do to follow Jesus. I know what he's asking of me, but I don't know how I could support myself doing that. I don't know how I could live that way. I don't know how I could. If you stick close to Jesus, your needs will be taken care of. God's will is that strong, that powerful. That's a great lesson from this. So Jesus asks you something to do in this life, and it seems like it's going to be a train wreck. Just know that he has the ability to take care of you in whatever it is he's asking you to do. Thanks for that. Somebody else? Uh-oh, we're running out. Yes?
Obedience.
Obedience. Where do you see obedience?
And the fact that when he goes to his disciples and telling them what to do, but they didn't show the obedience, it goes back to the faith. If they're having faith, they're being obedient.
Okay. Sometimes even if you don't have it all understood, but you need to be obedient. The key word is obedience. We're asked to be obedient. I think there's something to that. That's an excellent point. Can I toss a couple more to you? You should not yet, yes, because I'm going to. Like you, all right? I got the microphone, all right? Don't turn me off. All right? I'm just saying. That's a couple more. Jesus did, besides being compassionate, there's something Jesus did in both stories before they all ate. What was it? Pray. All right? He prayed. Prayer leads to the miracles. Now, maybe I'm stretching the story, but I think there's a good Bible principle here. I think there's a good pattern of God here. That prayer precedes the miraculous. Prayer leads the way for the provision. When there is not prayer, I don't know that we see much of the amazing things of God. Where there is prayer, it's amazing what can be unleashed, what can be open wide. And I think it's significant that Jesus, I mean, he's the Son of God, he's divine himself. If anybody doesn't need to pray, would you agree with me it's Jesus? I mean, he's God, why does he have to pray? But he models for us that prayer is a significant part of any amazing work of God. And maybe it would be true for us that we need to be diligent in praying about the things that are heavy on our hearts, the things where we would like to see God do something amazing. Do you have somebody that you just would love to see them come to know Jesus as Savior? Do you have somebody who you'd love to see God save their marriage? Or free them from the bitterness that seems to ruin their lives? Do you know somebody who's struggling with some kind of an addiction? Somebody who has a major health issue? Could it be that if you will posture yourself in consistent, persevering prayer, you might just see the powerful hand of God provide in some astounding ways in that? Jesus prayed before the miracle both times. There's one other thing he did right after the prayer, right before the miracle. It's a small thing, but it's important. Anybody see what it is? What is it? I'm sorry? He thanked God. That would be part of the prayer. I agree. He had a heart of thankfulness. It's actually a good lesson there. It's not what I was thinking, but it's a great lesson. Heart of gratitude. Jesus modeled it for us. Excellent. And what does he do with the bread? He breaks the bread, right? Now, maybe I'm stretching something, but I think there's another good Bible principle here. Amazing things come out of brokenness. Amazing things happen in the midst of brokenness. I have brokenness in my life because of sin and selfishness, because I live in a sin-filled world, because sin's been some part of my journey. I'd love to tell you that I'm this perfect person, but she would start laughing. Because I'm not. Anybody else have some brokenness in their life?
Yeah.
Okay, like all of us, in some way or another. And sometimes we might feel like, well, I'm a broken person. I have baggage in my life. I have pain in my life. I have hurt in my life. I have problems in my life. So I cannot be useful to Jesus. But actually, I think this story illustrates that when we acknowledge our brokenness and present ourselves to Him in our brokenness, we find that He can finally use us. Because when we pretended to have it all together, we were just putting on an act anyway. But out of the midst of brokenness can come great multiplication. Ultimately, out of brokenness, they satisfied thousands. Jesus, through your brokenness, can bring something of Himself to all kinds of people. It's a powerful thing that God can do.
He is a healer
He is our healer, is He not? That's right.
because I'm already doing dialysis for 12 years
Mm-hmm.
and now He helps
Yeah, now He is good. We praise God for that. God is wonderful. You are an example of the very things we're talking about, and I appreciate that. Thank you. That's right. That's right. God is good. Now, Roger and John, I think we did like about a dozen, 13, 14 different lessons out of this. You're all like ordained now, okay? It's like I'm going to deputize you as pastors. You all get this all figured out. You begin to see, by the way, I want you to just catch a little bit of a lesson here. Some people say, I don't understand the Bible. I couldn't think and figure out the Bible. Can you just see, if you get a few people together, like we are together right here, and just go, hey, let's just talk about what stands out to us in this story. There's so much to learn in the Bible.
Yeah.
We've just talked, these are just two stories in the Bible, and we just had fun for the last, 20 minutes just digging into these two stories and having a good time with that. All kinds of lessons. You can do this with some friends. The Bible is not always easy, but the lessons are actually fairly simple.
Yep.
It's not always easy to live, but they're pretty basic to understand. You can do this. You don't have to go to seminary. Figure it out. Now, I know we were talking, I'm not sure how this fits for the anniversary service. I did something that's maybe not fair. I withheld a part of the story. You didn't know that I did that. I'm revealing it to you now. There's one final part of the story I need to read to you, and then I want to make a point that I think will fit this church at your 3-year anniversary. It's still in chapter 8 at the end of it. I'm just going to read it, but you can follow along. We had stopped at verse 10 in chapter 8. Verse 11 says this: The Pharisees came and began to question Jesus and to test him, and they asked him for a sign from heaven. And Jesus sighed deeply. We just need to stop here for a second. What had just happened? Miracle. They just fed thousands of people. And the Pharisees, the religious leaders, like the pastors of the day, come to Jesus and go, well, we're not sure if we want to follow you and believe you or not. But if you would do like something miraculous, we might choose to believe you and follow you. And you go, really? Is that what you're going to say right now? Did you just had a bunch of food? Yeah, think, are you hungry right now? No. That's a miracle. And you want some different sign? We always, by this human nature, we always want something more from God. Oh, God, I'm not sure. There's all these things in the past where we go, God, if you would just do this, I would follow you. And God just goes, hey, have you read the book? Hey, do you remember what God has done in your life so far to get to where you're at today? Have you seen the fingerprints of God? And still you're going to go, God, if you'll just do this, then maybe I'll follow you. Well, that's what they're doing here. That's nuts. Right? That's bonkers. And no wonder Jesus sighed deeply. Really, if it were me, I would have probably gone off on them. Jesus just sighed. Really? Can you imagine how sad Jesus must have been? Jesus sighed deeply and he said, what does this generation ask? Why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly I tell you, no sign will be given to it. You got enough to see. And he left them, he got back in the boat across their side. Now here's the fun part of the story. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread.
Except for
Right?
one loaf.
Jesus gets in the boat with his 12 disciples. And they forgot to bring bread, except for one loaf that they had with them. Now these are strapping worker guys, right? They're fishermen and this kind of stuff. They can eat a loaf each of them themselves, like probably 3 loaves each. They got one loaf. Now Jesus was teaching them. He said, be careful. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod. What's yeast?
Yeah.
It's in bread, right? So it makes the bread rise. So he's talking to them. Jesus is using an illustration as he's teaching them, a little Bible study, and he uses bread as an illustration. Well, what's the yeast of Herod? Well, Herod was the religious leader. Basically what Jesus is saying, he's the symbol of the world system. And basically Jesus is saying, be careful of the yeast of worldliness. Worldliness, if it gets into your lives personally, or us as a group together, will start to affect us. This whole church could be impacted by worldly thinking. Is that true? I mean, look around America today, right? Okay? So, Jesus going, watch, it's like yeast. It's small. It doesn't seem like much, but it'll start to spread, and it'll get into everything. And worldliness will permeate all of you if you're not careful. And he also says, be careful of the yeast of the Pharisees. Well, the Pharisees are the religious leaders. Is Jesus saying don't be religious? That's not his point. But the Pharisees were stuck not in a true relationship with God. They were stuck in acting like they were spiritual and righteous. We call it religiosity. They acted very religious. And Jesus goes, hey, look at the religious leaders of today. It's like yeast. It'll just spread everything, and you just play the religious games, and you try to look like you're really spiritual when you're not. Don't do it. Jesus is giving them this lesson. And you think, this is powerful. The Son of God is teaching a lesson. These 12 guys are really getting it and learning the lesson, right? Wrong. They're not. Why not? They discussed this with one another, and they said, it's because we have no bread. What's that mean? They're looking at each other. Jesus is teaching this profound stuff. And they're going, you know why he's using bread and yeast as an illustration? It's because he knows we didn't bring enough lunch. He knows we don't have bread here, and he doesn't want to just come out and go, hey, who forgot to bring lunch? Peter, was it you? Andrew? John? Who did it? Come on. They're like, he doesn't want to just do that, so he's just kind of like suddenly twisting the knife and talking about bread just to make us squirm. And they're missing his whole lesson. Now, Jesus is a fairly perceptive person. Remember, he's God. Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? Don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many basketfuls did you pick up? 12, they replied. Now, by the way, they didn't just go 12. Here's how this went. They're sitting in the boat. And Jesus goes, hey, when we fed the 5,000, do you remember how many basketfuls we have? Now, by this point, they're feeling a little bit embarrassed and sheepish, right? It's like, Jesus, how many basketfuls? 12. 12. It's 12. It's 12. Jesus doesn't stop there, does he? He goes on, he says, and when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls apiece did you pick up? 7. And Jesus just looks at him and he says, do you still not understand? What is it that they needed to understand? There's probably a lot of ways we can go with this, but I think this is the main thing in my mind. If Jesus isn't a part of the story, 5 loaves and 2 fish are never enough.
Yeah.
But when Jesus is a part of the story, whatever we have is going to be plenty. And he can provide fully. He can provide extra. He can use our small gifts. He can use our brokenness. And he knows how to pray and lead us forward. His heart leads the way. His compassion fills us. When Jesus is present, it's always enough. And so whether you're thousands of people on a hillside or 12 guys in a boat with only one loaf for lunch, if Jesus is present, it's enough. It'll be okay. Do you not remember? So, here I just want to say, John, you and Yali, several years ago, there was not too long ago, not too many years ago, this idea of what we have sitting here today wasn't even a dream. It wasn't even on your radar. And look what Jesus has done. You know, Roger, you and Teresina and Nathan, you are like across the water in some faraway place. And here you are today. And all of you have a story that brought you here. None of you are here by accident. God's fingerprints are all over this church. He has done amazing things. In the coming days, I predict you will face some challenges. In the coming days, there will be some moments where you individually or maybe you as a whole church go, oh, we didn't see that coming. We don't know how to, whatever, feed the thousands. Whatever is the circumstance for you. And can I just say, I hope that at those moments, the voice of Jesus echoes in your mind. Do you not remember? Remember what? Jesus has been faithful in the past. Remember what he did with the 5,000. Remember what he did with the 4,000. Remember what he did before this church was born that still was being worked by God to bring it all together. Remember what he did in year 1. Remember what he did in year 2. Remember what he's done in year 3. And therefore, you can have incredible confidence that God will do amazing things in year 4 and 5 and beyond. It may not be the way you expect. They didn't expect to be hungry in the wilderness and have loaves and fish become meals for everybody. It might not work out like you thought, but when it's at the hands of Jesus, it will ultimately always be better. That's how incredible God is. I would love, before we move to the last part of the service, to have the privilege to pray over you. Pam and I are honored to serve you in the role that we have, and honored to be with you, to celebrate today. I just want to pray a blessing over you. If you'll join me in prayer, all right?
Amen.
Heavenly Father, you are so incredible. You put up with us with our mistakes. You forgive us though we make the same mistake over again. You see our small faith, and yet you still invite us to be a part of the journey. You challenge us to obey. You provide. You provide enough. You provide extra. You take what small gifts and resources we have in our own hands, and you multiply their impact. You take our brokenness, and you use it to multiply your touch points in the lives of the broken world. You model for us prayer and gratefulness, and how those actions and attitudes lead the way to the miraculous work of Jesus. And you remind us to remember again and again and again. Jesus, help me, help this church to never forget how incredible you are. We love you, Jesus, and we praise you in advance for what you're going